All right, we will resume this Economics Committee hearing, and I now welcome representatives from the Australian Funeral Directors Association. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee. Such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the grounds upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be made at any other time. Questions on notice will need to be back to us by the 10th of January. For the Hansard record, could you state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
My name is Andrew Pinder. I'm National President of the Australian Funeral Directors Association, AFDA, which also requires me to be a member of that association, which means I'm a funeral director as
Excellent.
well.
Welcome, Mr. Pinder. Do you wish to make some opening remarks?
Yes, please, Senator.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to make the submission on behalf of the AFDA. Briefly, by way of background, AFDA is an association of funeral directors and the largest in Australia, with members in every state and territory. And of the approximately 160,000 deaths in Australia last year, AFDA members conducted funerals for approximately 55,000 of those deaths. Our representation is around 35% of the market. About 1 in 3 funerals conducted in Australia. Our point of difference is around standards. Standards in conduct. We have standards of conduct, code of ethics, code of practice, and also standards around premises, equipment and vehicles. We conduct 3 yearly audits of our members' infrastructure. Our objections to the bill are in 2 parts. Firstly, in our opinion, the objectives of the bill miss their mark on the funeral sector. They're misplaced for the funeral sector, and I'll explain why. Secondly, the bill operates harshly on elderly and migrant communities. So regarding the objectives of the bill, there is no evil to cure in the funeral sector in relation to tax evasion. All deaths are registered by the funeral director, registered with the State Registrar of Births, Deaths and Marriages. It's an offence not to register the death, and that's how a client family receives an official death certificate, through the registration of the death. So it's highly improbable that a funeral director would avoid tax when an audit could be conducted of every funeral that they conduct in a year based on the registration of that death with the government registrar. In terms of receiving money for prepaid funerals, it's also an offence not to forward that money in those states which have legislation requiring the money to go to friendly societies. It's an offence not to forward the money to the friendly society, or otherwise deal with it in the requirements of state legislation under private trusts. And in terms of consumers, the government provides an incentive for consumers to take out either a prepaid funeral or a funeral bond by exempting those investments from the inclusion in assets for Centrelink purposes. So they're exempt assets, a prepaid funeral to the value of the prepaid funeral, whatever that is, and for a funeral bond to the value of $13,250, which I note is above $10,000. So these transactions in the hands of people of pension age aren't hidden transactions. They're recorded with Centrelink so that they can be exempt assets. The impact on the community is the main reason, the principal reason that we are here. The manner in which a funeral director is paid is of little impact to the funeral director. We are here because our role is to make it easier for client families when they have suffered a loss, when they are numb, and when they are feeling the helplessness associated with the loss of a loved one, probably the most difficult time in their life. Our role as funeral directors is to help people. It's to say yes rather than no to requests. It's to provide flexibility to people who need flexibility at that vulnerable time. And our code of ethics reinforces the need for us to respect cultural practices. We provide choice to people to make the experience of the funeral easier for them. A number of people wish to avoid bank cheque fees. They may have mobility issues in getting to banks, avoiding the queues. There are fewer branches these days. Personal cheques are being phased out. They're in a state of distress. So whatever makes it easier for people, we promote. Up to 50% of the time we visit the family to arrange the funeral, to make it easier for them again so that they don't have to travel. Migrant funerals are more likely to be above $10,000. Many migrant communities have burial rather than cremation, and burial is more expensive than cremation. The cost of burial sites for migrant communities, for example, the Christian Orthodox community in metropolitan cities, has doubled or trebled in the last 5 to 7 years in some areas, and it's not hard to get over $10,000 for a funeral when it involves a burial and a monumental grave. A monumental grave is a grave where a stone monument can be erected on the top, as opposed to a lawn grave. And the Christian Orthodox community is extensive. It includes Greek Orthodox, Macedonian, Serbian, Ukrainian, Russian, Bulgarian, Coptic, which is Egyptian, Antiochian, which is Lebanese. It's a very widespread religion. It also impacts European Catholic communities such as Polish and Croatian, and also Buddhist communities have a preference for paying cash in Vietnamese and Chinese communities. So they are the communities that will be impacted by this bill most profoundly, and a number of them have English as a second language. Those who are elderly are often not technologically savvy. Some are, but most aren't. And for those who do have credit cards or debit cards, their limits are generally nowhere near $10,000. They're around $1,000 or $2,000. Cemeteries require payment before the funeral if they're dealing directly with client families, and there's also an inconsistency in the way that GST operates and burial sites, in that there's no GST payable on a grave if the client family pay directly to the cemetery, but if the client family prefers every item to be on the funeral director's bill, rather than, when they're distressed, making one payment for a celebrant, another for flowers, another for the cemetery, then the funeral director is required to add 10% GST to the cost of the burial as well, which can be significant. For the same item, they're paying GST in one respect to the funeral director and not in another to cemeteries. They're my opening remarks. Thanks, Senators.
Great, thank you, Mr. Pinder. Just a few questions from me to start with. Can you give us a ballpark figure on a burial plot cost? You say costs have gone up 2-3-fold. Can you just give us an indicative price, perhaps in Sydney and Melbourne, or wherever you're most familiar with?
Well, I'm most familiar with Melbourne, and there are broadly three types of graves: lawn with a plaque, lawn with a headstone, and monumental. And the monumental graves can be in the order of $9,000 or more in metropolitan Melbourne.
Okay.
The further one goes out, the further the cemetery's out, normally from the city, normally the cheaper the grave is.
And again, just so we get a bit of an understanding of the scope of the issue you're describing, how many funerals would you undertake as a rough percentage? I'm not going to hold you to this. Perhaps you can go away and get me an exact figure, but above $10,000. Like, what percentage is it? Are we talking 10% or are we talking 50%?
We would be talking in the... So first of all, it'd depend if it were burial or cremation usually. If it were burial, it's much more likely to exceed $10,000.
Could you take that on notice and just give us a bit of a sense of either across your industry or, if you're willing to, in your particular business, the numbers of total funerals that would exceed $10,000?
Yes, I can do that.
And how many? Because I guess this is the the scope of the issue question is how many of those would actually be cash, and obviously I don't want to personalise that to your business. So could your industry association have a look at that, or?
Yeah, that sort of data is difficult to gather. It's not historically captured, but we can attempt to. And I suppose...
Even if we could get a flavour of, say, 3 or 4 businesses and keep them anonymous, keep the actual business names anonymous, of the breakdown of the number of funerals where cash has been used. You understand what I'm asking for there?
I do.
And just finally from me, you spoke about a number of ethnic communities using cash. Is that because that's the way they've always done it? They tend to work more in the cash economy, or are you saying there's a cultural reason why they're using cash, or?
I'm not all familiar with every motivation for why they're using cash, but I'm just saying what we see and what we experience. So there may be multiple reasons for for them using cash from a distrust of banks through to ease of access.
Right. So you think it's probably more in the practical space?
Well, it could be. I really am not aware of what
Okay.
the motives are
No
for
worries.
that, just the reality of it.
No, fair enough. Senator Gallagher.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I just want to go to the funeral bond and the prepaid funeral, which are exempt from the assets test under the pension. So,
Yeah.
so that's straight up government policy. So if you prepay your funeral or if you take a bond out, it's not counted as an asset.
That's right.
Okay.
The
if
bond
this-
up to 13,250. There's a cap on the bond amount. It's 13,250.
But what about the funeral?
Prepaid funerals uncapped.
Okay. So what if someone, if this legislation was enacted, wanted to comply with that but paid off in cash? That would be illegal?
I-
So if
Well-
they wanted to do a bond or a funeral and just came up with 20,000 and said, here, here's 20,000, I want to prepay my funeral, that would be illegal for you to accept that. If-
yeah, I was a lawyer in a past role. It would appear to me to be illegal, but
Well, we'll certainly be
because
asking.
it was one transaction.
We'll certainly be asking the officials that later on today.
So whether it's one transaction or two, there would be an ABN number on one hand and a citizen with cash on the other, and a $10,000 limit. It would appear to be contrary to the legislation.
That was my understanding.
Okay. So if you accept at the moment cash for either the funeral bond or the prepaid funeral, how do you deal with that? You just put it through your books, you pay whatever appropriate GST there is, and
Yes. So right now, whatever the amount is, we
and
receipt.
you can't bury a person without the government knowing. So it doesn't. The transaction's always visible.
And not without breaking a lot of laws.
Exactly. So the transaction is visible to any authority that wants to look at it. So you can't sort of say, I didn't get any income for that burial.
Yes. I would think that the funeral sector was the last sector where there would be a black economy.
Exactly. So the focus really would be not on your industry in trying to fix a problem there. It would more be, how did the person come by the cash? That would be the question. That's not for you because it's legal tender.
Could be. They may have saved it over a number of years because a lot of elderly people don't want to be a burden to their family, and they state that openly, and so some of them save over years to get enough money to prepay their funeral or to have enough money for when the time comes.
Okay. So at the very least, you would be saying there should be an exemption here
Absolutely.
because there's no black economy, there's no wrongdoing. The government already tries to encourage people to prepay or have a bond, and what's in question now is how you actually do that.
Well, AFDA feels that the legislation treats the elderly and elderly migrant community very harshly and even in a discriminatory way.
Okay. So you mentioned 55,000 funerals out of the 160,000 deaths. So that's your association.
Correct.
So there are 2 associations, 10 associations, or
There are another 2. There's a third one which is very small, but there's one which is in New South Wales, specific to a state, and there's another smaller one.
okay. So you obviously have your code of conduct. You represent people. You have audit standards. That's what you said in your opening submission. And there's no evidence that there's anything untoward in your association, full stop.
The complaints about the funeral sector, when when anyone asks the consumer affairs authorities in each of the states, they're very, very low. Compared to other sectors, they're incredibly low, and quite often they extend to people complaining about monumental masons and the job they've done at the grave, or that the celebrant didn't use the wrong name, for example, rather than actual complaints about the funeral director.
Okay. So from your organisation's perspective, this bill is not, is going to add, what is it going to do to you though if you have to refuse cash payments? What's going to happen?
Well, it makes it more distressing on the person who's lost their loved one, that they might have to make a trip to the bank that they otherwise weren't going to make, or it's often the last thing that they want to worry about is having to make another decision, any decision, because very often they're numb, they're in pain emotionally.
So, I mean, I do have almost personal experience with this. So you get a will and there's an envelope there with a substantial amount of cash, which has got a funeral payment. So under the new law, they would have to go to the bank and explain why they're depositing 20,000 or 10,000 or 15, and then withdraw it, or at least transact it, out of their account. And you'll just say, well, it's really, you should just allow people to pay in cash if that's what the deceased wanted.
Yes.
Would it be necessary that it's in a will, or would it?
Well, we try to give effect to as many wishes of the deceased and the client family as we can and legally can. So quite often the person who passed away will have made arrangements to prepay their funeral, and then all the risk of cost increases move to the funeral director, and they don't have to worry about interest rates or where the money goes. That investment's protected under state legislation. Whatever promotes choice, whatever makes it easier for grieving people, we support, because that's our role, is to help make it easier for them.
And I know the Chair's asked you to take on notice what percentage funerals would have some component of more than 10,000 in cash. Do you have a ballpark figure? Is it a 10% issue, a 20% issue, or 50%?
I'd be thinking it'd be in the order of 5 to 10%, but it's the specific communities that I'm thinking about more. If we're looking at the Orthodox communities or the European Catholic or the Buddhist communities, it could be as high as 50, 60% or more. Okay. It's not the across the board number, I think, which is which causes the harshness in this instance. It's the effective targeting of specific communities that have a strong preference for cash, culturally and historically.
Okay, so what did the scrutiny bills say about that, human rights? Might have to just go back and refresh ourselves on that. All right, well, thanks very much.
Just said anything. That's all. Thank you very much for being here today, Mr. Pinder. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Senators. Thank you.
And we will move on to the Uniting Church in Australia.